The first time I saw her, she was standing in my driveway with a clipboard and a sour expression like she just sniffed a rotting lemon. Her name was Cheryl Haskins, head of the Pinecrest Ridge HOA, self-appointed queen of the mountain, and a certified nightmare. "I counted 7 vehicles on your property, Mr. Nolan," she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard like she was issuing a death sentence. "That's 4 over the limit." I leaned against the side of my old green pickup, wiping grease off my hands. "It's a cabin, not a subdivision." "There's no limit." She flipped a page. Pinecrest Ridge HOA Bylaw 16 states no more than 3 personal vehicles may be visible from the road. 7 is excessive. I blinked at her, then looked over her shoulder at the long, winding gravel drive leading up to my log cabin surrounded by pine trees, no neighbors in sight. "Visible from what road exactly?" Cheryl huffed. "That's not the point. Your vehicle count is disruptive to the aesthetic harmony of the community. I'm issuing a fine." I laughed. "Aesthetic harmony. The raccoons don't seem to mind." She didn't laugh. She scribbled something down and handed me a pink slip of paper. "You'll receive a fee increase of $85 per month, effective immediately." I stared at the paper, then back at her. "You can't just raise my fees over cars." "That's not how this works." "I can and I have," she said, heels clicking as she turned and marched back down the gravel like it was her runway. "Now, here's the part Cheryl didn't know. My name's Vaughn Nolan. I bought this cabin 5 years ago after leaving my public defender job in Denver." What Cheryl also didn't know, because she'd never bothered to check, is that I didn't just buy the cabin. I bought the entire ridge, 40 acres, all of it. From the tree line behind her precious cull to Sac all the way to the lake on the far side. Technically, the HOA had no jurisdiction here. But Cheryl had been overstepping with everyone for months, sending fines, threatening liens, and rewriting bylaws like she was running a dictatorship. And now she'd come for me, nah. That night, I pulled out the property deed from my file cabinet, snapped a photo of the legal description, and printed out a map with a fat red line around the ridge. The next morning, I drove down into the HOA neighborhood just past the "Welcome to Pinecrest Ridge" sign Cheryl had installed without a vote, and pulled into the community center parking lot. Their monthly meeting was that night. I parked all 7 of my vehicles in a perfect row in front of the building. My truck, the trailer, my cousin's Jeep, the ATV hauler, even the snowmobile rig, all clean, all shiny. When Cheryl arrived, her jaw tightened like she was trying not to scream. "Mr. Nolan, what do you think you're doing?" I stepped out of the truck, holding a folder. "Just attending the meeting. I believe I've got some paperwork to share." "You can't park all of these here." "Why not? No HOA rule about guests parking in the community center lot." "Or is there?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. The meeting started at 6. Cheryl tried to start with her usual nonsense about flowerbed violations and mailbox height, but I raised my hand. She scowled. "This isn't a Q&A. Then consider this a correction." I walked to the front and laid out the map and deed on the table. "You fined me for too many cars on my property, but according to this, my property isn't in your HOA, never has been." The room went quiet. People leaned forward. I pointed to the map. "See this ridge here? Everything above the fire road belongs to me. I own it top to bottom, and your bylaws don't apply." Cheryl's face went red. "That's impossible. That entire area was never annexed." I checked the county filings. "You've been issuing fines and raising fees on land you don't control. That's fraud." Her clipboard slipped from her hand. I looked around the room. "How many of you have been fined for nonsense like this? Mailbox colors, wind chimes, driveway slope." A few people started nodding. An older man in the back raised his hand. "She fined me for having a woodpile." Cheryl snapped. "That was a fire hazard." "It was stacked and covered," he shot back. I turned back to Cheryl. "You might want to call a lawyer, because if you've been collecting illegal fees, that's not just bullying. That's criminal." She opened her mouth, but this time nothing came out, just silence. Cheryl didn't show up at the next HOA meeting. Instead, a man in a navy knit sweater vest and horn-rimmed glasses introduced himself as Doug Ellman, interim liaison for the Pinecrest Ridge Association. He had the kind of voice that sounded like it practiced in the mirror, measured, polite, and hollow. I understand there were concerns raised at the last meeting, Doug said, adjusting his glasses. We're currently reviewing those matters internally. I sat in the back, arms crossed, letting him talk. Doug was clearly there to clean up the mess Cheryl left behind, but the way he avoided eye contact told me he knew exactly how deep that mess was. I didn't need to press him, not yet. I'd already filed a formal complaint with the county assessor's office, and I wasn't the only one. 2 days after the meeting, I got a knock on my cabin door. Not a clipboard this time, just a man in a faded Broncos cap and a windbreaker with a cracked zipper. "Name's Marvin," he said, holding out a hand. "Used to sit on the HOA board before Cheryl pushed me out." I stepped aside and let him in. "She booted me when I asked to see the financials," he said, settling into a chair by the stone fireplace. "Started changing the bylaws without votes. Claimed it was emergency authority. That woman treated the HOA like her personal fiefdom." I poured him a cup of coffee and slid over the folder I'd used at the meeting. "You know if anyone ever actually voted to expand HOA boundaries?" he snorted. "Not a chance. Cheryl just started adding properties to the dues list. Folks assumed it was official, but the county records don't match. I checked." I leaned forward. "You still have your old board documents," he nodded slowly. "Locked up in my garage." "She never made me give them back." Marvin came back the next morning with a battered accordion folder stuffed with faded printouts, emails, and handwritten notes. There were drafts of budgets, meeting minutes, and buried near the back a letter from Cheryl to a local paving contractor. I scanned the paper, then read it again. "You seeing this?" I asked, turning it toward him. "She used HOA funds to pay for her driveway," he said. "That ain't even a shared road." The letter authorized a payment of over $12,000 to repave a private drive leading to Cheryl's house nowhere near any common areas. It was signed with a flourish and stamped with the HOA seal. I took photos of everything and emailed them to the county treasurer's office. 24 hours later, I got a call from a woman named Dana, who identified herself as an investigator with the state controller's office. "We've received multiple allegations of fraudulent use of HOA funds in Pinecrest Ridge," she said. "We'd like to speak with you in person." We met at a diner off the highway. Dana wore a gray blazer and carried a legal pad so full of notes it looked like it had sprouted wings. I handed her copies of the documents Marvin gave me. She didn't speak for several minutes as she flipped through them. "This is enough to trigger an audit," she said finally. "If we can verify that payments were made for personal benefit with HOA funds, criminal charges are on the table." She asked about the inflated fines, and I explained how Cheryl had been issuing them outside her jurisdiction. Dana scribbled furiously. "You said the boundary expansion wasn't filed with the county." "Confirmed it myself," I said. "It was never even proposed at a meeting." Then she had no legal authority to collect dues from those lots. Within a week, uniformed auditors arrived at the Pinecrest Ridge Community Center with county deputies flanking them. They came with warrants and boxes. Residents watched from porches as documents were hauled out in plastic totes and loaded into the back of a state vehicle. Doug tried to play it cool when the news crews showed up, claimed the board was fully cooperating. But by then, the story had spread past the county lines. I got a call from a local journalist named Tasha who'd caught wind of the audit. She asked if I'd be willing to go on record. "Only if you print the map," I said. "People need to see it." She did more than that. Her article went viral locally. The headline: "HOA Queen fined the wrong man, turns out he owns the whole mountain, the piece laid everything out. The illegal fines, the misuse of funds, the fake boundary expansions." Cheryl was unreachable for comment. Her house sat dark for 3 days before a moving truck pulled up under cover of dusk. I figured that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 weeks later, I came home to find a certified letter taped to my cabin door. It was from the Pinecrest Ridge Legal Committee, an entity that, as far as I could tell, didn't exist before Cheryl's mess unraveled. They were threatening to sue me for damaging the reputation of the HOA. I laughed out loud and called Dana. "They're trying to file a slap suit," she said. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. It's meant to intimidate you into silence." "Is it legal in this case?" Not even close. She referred me to a civil attorney named Elise out of Boulder who specialized in HOA abuse cases. Elise read the letter, raised an eyebrow, and said, "Let's go on a fence." She filed a preemptive motion under Colorado's anti-SLAPP statute, and within a week, the so-called legal committee was forced to withdraw. The judge even ordered them to pay my fees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling they weren't done. And I was right. A few nights later, motion lights flared outside my workshop. I checked the feed on my phone and saw a man in a hoodie crouching beside my tool trailer, holding a canister. I didn't go outside. I called the sheriff. They caught him before he could do much more than scratch up the paint. He turned out to be Cheryl's nephew, same last name, recent DUI, still listed at her address. I pressed charges. When deputies searched Cheryl's abandoned house, they found boxes of shredded HOA records, including cash deposit slips that didn't match the association's books. That's when Dana called me again. "This just escalated to felony embezzlement," she said. "We're talking hundreds of thousands misappropriated over the past 3 years." I stood outside that evening, watching the sunset bleed over the ridge. What had started as a petty fine had exposed a full-blown criminal operation. But the best part wasn't the arrest warrant or the headlines. It was the letter I got the next week from the county commissioner's office. They were dissolving the Pinecrest Ridge HOA. The morning frost hadn't yet melted from the tall grass when I got a call from Elise. "They've found a second set of books," she said without preamble. Hidden in a crawlspace under the community center stage, one of the auditors stepped through a loose plank and nearly broke his ankle. I set my mug down on the railing and leaned forward. "How bad?" She paused, then said, "They were laundering money through a shell landscaping company." Payments were signed off by 3 board members. 2 of them still live in the neighborhood. I didn't ask how much. I didn't need to. Elise's tone said it all. By noon, 2 deputies and a county investigator were walking door to door with sealed envelopes. Marvin called me from his porch. "They just served subpoenas to the Hensleys," he said. "Both of them sat on the board last year. They looked like ghosts." I drove down into town just after lunch and parked outside the assessor's office. Dana was waiting inside, her blazer damp from the sleet. She motioned me into the side conference room where a whiteboard had been set up, covered in names and arrows. "They used the HOA account to pay a non-existent company called Ridgeview Maintenance," she said, tapping one of the arrows. "Monthly checks, same amount, same memo. No services rendered." I scanned the board. What were they doing with the cash? Deposits into a joint bank account registered under Cheryl's cousin's name. That account funded a cabin renovation in Idaho and a series of wire transfers to Belize. I sat down slowly. So this wasn't just greed. It was a full-blown exit strategy, Dana nodded. And it nearly worked. That afternoon, deputies executed a search warrant on the Hensleys' house. Neighbors stood behind fences, watching as bags of shredded documents and a desktop tower were hauled out. Marvin called again, voice low. They found a safe in the garage, took a locksmith to crack it, whole stack of cashier's checks inside. I didn't say anything. I just listened. That night, I got a knock on my door. It was Tom, a retired lineman who lived just outside the original HOA boundary. He'd heard what happened at the Hensleys and brought a cardboard box labeled HOA crap. "I kept everything from the year I appealed my driveway grading fine," he said, setting the box on my porch table. "They said I'd violated slope regulations. I live on a hill." I opened the box. Inside were letters, inspection photos, and one curious item. A typed memo with no letterhead, just a signature line that reads CH. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. Tom leaned closer. "That's the internal memo they sent me by mistake. It's about a vote to retroactively authorize driveway grading fines. They never actually held the vote." I scanned the language. It wasn't just shady, it was premeditated. The memo suggested backdating fines and creating precedents for revenue collection. I forwarded the memo to Elise and Dana before the end of the hour. Elise called me after dinner. "That's the nail in the coffin," she said. "They weren't just mismanaging funds. They were manufacturing violations to fund the laundering operation." Any idea how far back this goes? Earliest memo we've found is dated 4 years ago. Cheryl didn't just bend the rules. She built a system around breaking them. The next day, the sheriff's department held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Reporters gathered under umbrellas as the undersheriff read from a prepared statement. Charges have been filed against 4 individuals connected to the Pinecrest Ridge Homeowners Association, including wire fraud, mail fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Additional charges are pending. I watched the footage from my cabin. Cheryl hadn't been located yet, but the Hensleys had been taken into custody. A third board member had turned herself in. According to the report, her lawyer was already negotiating a plea. I got a call from Tasha, the journalist who broke the first story. "I'm putting together a follow-up," she said. "I want to highlight how your evidence exposed the entire scheme." I hesitated. This wasn't about me. It was about stopping a group of people who thought they could use a fake authority to bleed a community dry. "Then say that on the record." I agreed. She met me at the edge of the ridge, her photographer snapping pictures of the lake while we talked. I pointed out where the property line really was, where Cheryl had marched up with her clipboard, where the entire mess began. "I think people are afraid of HOAs because they feel trapped," I said. "You buy a home and suddenly you're at the mercy of a handful of people who treat bylaws like personal ammunition. But the law still matters. You just have to be willing to use it." After the article ran, I started getting letters, handwritten ones. Some from nearby counties, others from states away. People shared stories about their own HOA nightmares, arbitrary fines, selective enforcement. One man in Arizona said his HOA tried to evict him for parking a work truck in his own driveway. One letter stood out. It was from a woman named Marla who lived just over the ridge in a different association. She said she'd read about what happened and wanted to meet. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our places. Marla was soft-spoken, wore thick glasses, and carried a 3-inch binder. "Our HOA president has been issuing citations for things that aren't in the bylaws," she said. "And when we asked to see the financial records, they told us to file a request through a third-party management firm. The firm doesn't exist." I opened her binder. Inside were copies of letters, budget breakdowns, and photos of community areas falling apart despite rising dues. "They're using fear," I said, "and most people just pay to make it go away." She looked up. "Can you help us? I can show you where to start, but the rest." "That's on your neighbors," she nodded. When I got back to the cabin, Marvin was waiting at the gate. He handed me a folded sheet of paper. "Town council's holding a vote next week," he said. "They want to repurpose the old HOA community center into a public rec hall. They're asking you to speak." I stared at the paper. "They sure that's a good idea," he smiled. "You're the reason we're not still paying fake fines to fund someone's beach house in Belize. I think you've earned a few minutes at the mic." The vote passed with a landslide. At the dedication ceremony, I stood on the same steps where Cheryl used to lecture people about mailbox alignment and wind chimes. This time, there were kids running around, someone grilling hot dogs, and a band setting up on the lawn. I looked out over the crowd, saw the Hensleys' old place with a for sale sign, and the deputy's cruiser parked calmly across the street. "Pinecrest Ridge doesn't need an HOA anymore," I said, voice steady. "We've got each other, and when that's not enough, we've got the law. If anyone ever tries to take that from you again, don't just fight back. Expose the whole foundation." The applause was real, not polite, not forced. Real. Marvin raised a cup in my direction from a picnic bench. As the sun dipped behind the pines, I drove back up the ridge with all 7 of my vehicles parked in a perfect arc around the cabin. The place was quiet, the way it should be. No fines, no pink slips, no clipboards. Just the sound of wind moving through the trees, and the knowledge that the next time someone tried to play king of the mountain, they'd find out real fast who actually owned the land beneath their feet. The county didn't waste time once the audit wrapped. A special grand jury was convened within weeks, and subpoenas kept flying. Since the HOA had been officially dissolved, any remaining funds were frozen pending legal outcomes. Meanwhile, the state comptroller's office issued an advisory to nearby municipalities warning them to examine their own HOA oversight policies. Pinecrest Ridge had become a case study in what happens when no one's watching the watchers. I thought that would be the last of it until I got a call from Dana, her voice clipped, unusually direct. "We've got a problem," she said. "A serious one." I stood up from my workbench, wiping sawdust from my hands. "What now?" A contractor came forward. Said he was paid to clear land for a road that doesn't exist. "Where?" "North Slope. County plat says it's protected watershed. No development allowed. But someone filed forged permits last spring to authorize grading work. Guess which HOA signed off on it?" The answer didn't need to be spoken. I drove down to the planning office the next day. Dana met me at the back with a manila envelope. Inside were satellite photos taken over the past year. One showed a narrow path carved through dense forest, barely visible to the untrained eye. Another showed erosion already swallowing part of the slope. I leaned over the table. "That's protected land. If sediment gets into those tributaries, it'll reach the reservoir," Dana nodded. "And it gets worse." The work was contracted under a false business name. The LLC was registered to a P.O. box in New Mexico. We traced the payments through 4 intermediary accounts. All roads lead back to Cheryl. "Let me guess," I said. "She planned to sell off parcels once the road was in." Dana pulled out a printed email chain between Cheryl and an out-of-state real estate firm. She had a deal lined up to sell 10 half-acre lots on newly accessible land. The buyers were told the HOA had already approved the subdivision. "But the HOA never had that authority," I said. "And it's not just fraud anymore. It's environmental crime." The district attorney agreed. A multi-agency task force was activated, including environmental protection officers and a federal investigator from the U.S. Forest Service was assigned to assess the damage. I went with them to the site. The path was real, cut deep and raw through what used to be untouched pine and spruce. Heavy equipment tracks had left gouges in the soil, and runoff was already forming little rivulets down the slope. The Forest Service agent shook his head. This wasn't just careless. This was calculated. They bulldozed through a protected corridor without even attempting to disguise it. Dana handed him the forged permits. "We've confirmed the signatures were digitally manipulated." Cheryl used a scanned version of a retired county engineer's signature. That was the tipping point. The U.S. Attorney's office stepped in and issued a federal indictment, charging Cheryl with felony forgery, wire fraud, environmental violations, and conspiracy to defraud the government. They found her in a rental house outside Boise, operating under an alias. When the marshals brought her back to Colorado, she kept her head down, sunglasses on, and refused to speak at arraignment. News vans lined the courthouse steps. I wasn't there for the hearing, but Elise called me just after. "Judge denied bail, flight risk. She'll be held until trial." Good. Back on the ridge, recovery began. The county applied for emergency conservation funding to repair the damage. Volunteers showed up on weekends. Folks who'd once been fined for mailbox colors, now planting erosion control barriers and hauling straw bales into place. Marla arrived with her HOA board from across the valley. They brought hand tools, gloves, and a cooler of lemonade. "We figured if one ridge can hold out, so can the rest of us," she said, handing me a shovel. The work was steady, honest, no clipboards, no threats. Just neighbors fixing what greed had broken. Months passed. Cheryl's trial drew closer. The prosecution's evidence was overwhelming: financial records, fake permits, contractor testimony, even a recorded phone call where she coached a board member on how to backdate a vote. I was called to testify, not just about the land, but about the culture of silence she'd created. I told the jury what it felt like to have your property rights twisted into a revenue stream. I outlined how she'd weaponized bureaucracy to intimidate people who just wanted to be left alone. Elise sat behind me, tapping notes as I spoke. Dana nodded from the gallery. After 5 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge didn't hold back. During sentencing, he called her actions a deliberate and sustained assault on democratic governance, property rights, and environmental stewardship. She was sentenced to 21 years in federal prison without parole. 3 more former board members accepted plea deals. 2 were sentenced to house arrest and community service. The third got 18 months for obstruction and falsifying records. But it didn't end there. The district attorney proposed a new ordinance requiring all HOAs in the county to submit annual financial reports for public inspection. A civilian oversight committee was formed, consisting of homeowners, legal observers, and municipal officials. Elise was asked to help draft the bylaws. She asked me to join. I declined. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd already fought my fight. I'd exposed the rot. It was someone else's turn to build something better. Besides, I had ridge work to do. One late afternoon, Marvin showed up with a trailer full of saplings. "Reclamation grant came through," he said. "These are white fir and lodgepole pine, fast growers. Good for stabilizing soil." We spent the rest of the day planting trees along the scarred path. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the new growth. As we finished the last hole, Marvin leaned on his shovel. "Think we'll ever have to deal with something like that again?" I shook my head. "Not here, not after what happened." He looked around. "Funny, isn't it? All that power, all that control, and it all fell apart because she picked the wrong driveway." I laughed just once. She thought she was the queen of the mountain. Forgot that the mountain wasn't hers. As spring rolled in, the scars on the north slope began to fade beneath fresh needles and sprouting ground cover. The birds came back. The deer trails reopened. And the ridge, once shadowed by corruption, stood clean again. No more forged permits. No more fake fines. No more HOA, just a cabin, a ridge, and the quiet strength that comes from saying no, standing firm, and proving that even the most tangled lies can't hold up when the truth is planted deep and left to grow.